We get the government that we choose because we chose to make this government. Nobody's going to do this for us. We decided we don't want King George telling us what to do. We don't want the modern czar, Vladimir Putin, telling us what to do. We're going to decide for ourselves, but if we don't decide, if we don't vote, if we don't know what we're voting about when we do, we're not going to be able to be a free people. Every time I have someone tell me that we really need to get rid of all these protests, you shouldn't be able to burn a flag. You know, my father-in-law, as far right-wing a guy as there was in America and a very influential figure in his day, argued many Supreme Court cases. My father-in-law, naval officer, rose to captain, said, what did I go fight World War II for if it wasn't to protect people's right to do things I hate, like burn a flag? We go crazy over somebody who says they're going to take a knee at a football game, but not over people who are desecrating our flag in other ways. And one of the things has flowed out of this that's very connected. Those of us with gray hair in this room can remember the 60s as the era when we talked about empowerment, that we had demonstrations. There were college buildings that I was covering these things for the San Jose Mercury when I was literally a teenager. I was a front page staff writer at that newspaper. And students were out changing the world. And now, what will people tell you? I get letters, you can't fight City Hall. The corporations have all the power. We can't do anything about it. And let me give you a really good example of how completely powerless people feel. I run a little news service called DC Report, which I hope all of you bookmark and go to. DC Report's mission is to cover what the current administration and Congress is doing to our government. We have broken lots of stories that became news much later, often with no credit to us. For example, today's New York Times has a story about a Supreme Court case that the excellent Adam Liptak, who covers the Supreme Court, didn't put it this way, but we did, has the potential to completely undo the Clean Water Act's most important provisions and just let companies pollute. Depending on how this case is decided, the requirement for a permit, if you have a drain that goes into the Hackensack River here, or into any other river, you'll be able to get around by simply drilling a hole in the ground and having it drain into the ground, because then it's not a point of pollution going into a navigable waterway. We wrote about that months ago. We wrote about coal slurry ponds. Some of them are 100 years old, and they've been breaking and ruining people's drinking water, not to mention killing wildlife, and all sorts of other stuff, because we just cover the public record. We look at what's in the Federal Register. We don't expect people to read the Federal Register. We do think journalists should read the Federal Register. And we've been focusing on these issues for people to inform them. Well, the response we get from a lot of people is, who cares about government? Your liberties entirely depend on our government. They 100% depend on it. Look what's happening in Russia with the modern czar. The most minor people involved in challenging the government are being rounded up and disappeared. It's Argentina, except they're not throwing, as best we know, people out of airplanes into the South Atlantic. But people are just being disappeared. By the way, in America, we have thousands, we now know, of children who parents came to the southern border, or sometimes they came to the southern border on their own, seeking asylum, which they are legally entitled to apply for, like our law or not, that's the law, who've just disappeared. There are no records of what happened to them. What do you think the odds are that some of them have ended up in the possession of pedophiles? I'd say they're about equal to the likelihood the sun is going to rise in the east tomorrow. Of course, that's what's happened to some of them. We get the government that we work for. Now, it's very hard for us to do that these days because we've changed our society. Up until the 60s, most women who had small children stayed at home. This is not an argument that women should be barefoot and pregnant. My wife's a CEO, okay? But what about all the women who work out of economic necessity because of falling wages? That's the group we should be concerned about. And to think that we don't pay some kind of a price for not having at least one stay-at-home parent is foolish. Of course they pay a price for that. There's a concept I like to use in my reporting I call the UL, the Universal Ledger. All costs are accounted for in the Universal Ledger. The financial statements of a company only account for those costs they have to pay attention to. So pollution that goes up the smokestack or down the drain pipe, mistreatment of workers who become sick or disabled and have to end their careers early, those don't show up on the books of the company. Shorting the pension plan so it later collapses and the taxpayers have to pick it up, those don't show up on the books of the company, but they all show up on the Universal Ledger. Every cost is accounted for on the Universal Ledger. The Europeans have decided that the next generation, the evergreen next generation, is so important that they require you in a number of countries to not work. In Norway, where a bunch of my ancestors come from north of the Arctic Circle, you are not allowed to work if you have a small child. And by the way, both mom and dad have to take time off. You take it together, you can take it separately, but you both have to take time off. That's how important they think it is. Now, how many of you have been to Norway? You notice the extent of all the poverty caused by this program? The houses are falling apart, the roads, right. It's ridiculous. It works perfectly well. They do have some billionaires, but they don't have nearly as many as we do. And proportion to their population, they don't have as many, but they have a healthy, happy society. People don't have time to go do things like turn out tonight. Why is this audience not full of people in their 20s and 30s and 40s? Because they're working like dogs to put together a living. They're trying to buy houses when we've created a housing market that, you know, the New York Times runs these little, I call them real estate porn things on Sunday. What $2 million will buy you, you know, $2 million for a house? Oh, wow. Well, tyrants breed in this environment. Now, I'm not worried about Donald Trump seizing power. He does not have the support of our military officer corps. We learned that very early in his administration from some incidents that happened, but more importantly, a poll by Military Times. And in the military, let me use the Army as my model here, so I have to get deep into ranks. Lieutenants through majors are tactics. Colonels and generals do strategy. The strategy people have no use for Donald Trump. I have met many, many general officers of the U.S. military. Every single one of them, I walked away and said to myself, that person is competent and I see why they were promoted. They may have been jerks of the first water, because some of them were absolute horrible human beings, but I respected that they were competent. That is, our system for identifying and promoting military officers for leadership actually works. In my biography of Donald Trump, I cite the Army Field Manual 6, which is the selection of officers for promotion because they have leadership skills. And someone who knows this better than I do had reduced this to 6 basic lessons. Do you take responsibility for what you do? Do you credit other people? Are you open to recognizing a mistake and correcting it, et cetera? And Donald Trump flunks every one of those measures, every single one of them. But because he doesn't have real leadership skills, he's who he is. He's a con man and a con artist. He's not a businessman. He's a cash extractor who gets a hold of a business, takes cash out of it, and puts it aside. He's not capable of being a tyrant and taking over the country. That's not going to happen. But we need to worry about what happens when someone comes along who has a really deep philosophy. Adolf Hitler had a really deep philosophy, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 100 years of German and Polish and Austrian and Russian and Belarus and Ukrainian literature and philosophy about the demon Jews and the Romas and the cripples and the other, that's their word, not mine. And he was deeply steeped in this stuff. What about competent managers? Another thing I can see, Vladimir Putin appears to be a reasonably competent manager. He's the leader of the biggest international gang in the world. These are the criminals who stole the wealth of the old Soviet, which in theory, right, belonged to the people, but the people didn't get shares of stock. This small group of people did. And he's just the leader of the gang. And the way criminal gang leaders work, and I've written about lots of criminal gangs over my career, I don't want to spend my time dealing with your squabble with you. You know, this is your territory, that's your territory, don't bother me. If there's a problem, I'll intervene. If necessary, I'll have one of you whacked. Because I want to do what I want to do. By the way, that's how the pharaohs operated in Egypt. They want to deal with people's petty problems. So they set up, I kid you not, the equivalent of a modern wage and hour court in 1350, before the current era. We have records of a trial from a guy who got cheated on his wages. You delegate out, you set certain boundaries. That's how tyrants operate. Well, there are people in this country looking at what's going on right now, and either for themselves or someone they think they can put in that position. Because remember, every politician has people around them who are going to promote them. There's a great scene in the movie by Aaron Sorkin, The American President, where the president is Michael Douglas and the advisor is Martin Sheen, and they're playing pool. And he lectures him that he wouldn't be in the White House. He'd be the most popular history professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but for the Martin Sheen character pushing him to go where he needs to go. There are people out there looking at what we're doing in this country and realizing Americans have become so disaffected from their government, so disconnected from it, so amenable to messages like all taxes are bad. Tax is the most vile three-letter word in America. Trying to get people to understand, as I'm going to try and do in my next book, that we can have a wholly different tax system that will actually make us wealthier. I hope the publisher agrees to call it the prosperity tax. It's going to be a very tough sell because so many people have been brainwashed on this idea that tax, bad. Try to tell them we created this country so we could tax ourselves. What? Nobody ever told me that. Well, those kinds of people we need to worry about. Think about someone who's like Donald Trump in that he has this charisma, and you got to hand it to Donald. He's a great con man. He has these audiences wrapped around his finger. People who believe literally, you know, he looks up to the sky and implies that he's God. Did you see any pastors or rabbis or imams saying that's sacrilegious? I didn't. I looked. There may have been somewhere, but it certainly didn't make the news anywhere. He just now has someone on his staff in the White House who basically says the Democrats are demonic. Yeah. And it's really quite shocking to see what this person who's what I call a faux Christian, she's a God wants me to be rich, so send me money and God will love you sort of person. These kinds of folks, they're looking to advance their interests because they aren't thinking about the society around them. They're thinking about anything in the New Testament about your obligation to your fellow citizen. They think, I'm in this for me, and how do I get the system to work for me? And that's how tyrants work.